Julia Martha Thomas liked to look prosperous. She wasn't wealthy, a twice-widowed former schoolteacher living alone on a modest income in Richmond, just outside London, but she dressed well and wore her jewellery whenever she left the house, giving neighbours the impression of a woman rather better off than she actually was. It was a small vanity, the kind most people would forgive without a second thought. In March of 1879, it would not save her life. And it would take 131 years, and a chance discovery in the garden of a man who would go on to become one of the most recognisable broadcasters in British history, before anyone could say for certain exactly how she died. We'll get to that discovery. But it starts, as these things usually do, with an ordinary domestic arrangement that curdled into something else entirely. Before we go further, I want to ask you something, because this case turns on a question that still comes up whenever someone is convicted largely on circumstantial evidence. If a woman confesses to a killing, changes her story twice, tries to blame 3 separate men who all turn out to have solid alibis, and only tells the truth the night before her own execution, how much of what she originally claimed should we actually believe? Keep that in mind. By the end of this, you'll have heard her own words about what happened on that staircase, and you'll have to decide for yourself how much of it to trust. Julia Martha Thomas had been widowed twice by the time she settled into Tuku Mayfield Cottages on Park Road in Richmond, a modest 2-storey villa she'd occupied alone since her second husband's death in 1873. She had spent part of her earlier life working as a schoolteacher, and by her 50s she lived comfortably enough, if not wealthily, on what her 2 marriages had left her. Her doctor described her as a small, well-dressed woman of about 54. Those who knew her called her eccentric. She had an excitable temperament, travelled often without telling anyone where she'd gone, and had a reputation as a demanding employer. Before 1879, she had never managed to keep a live-in servant for very long, a pattern that should perhaps have given her more pause than it did. That reputation should have mattered more than it did when, on the 29th of January that year, she hired a new housemaid, a 30-year-old Irishwoman named Kate Webster. Webster arrived with a past Thomas never bothered to check. Born Kate Lawler in County Wexford, Ireland, around 1849. She had been imprisoned for larceny as young as 15, moved to England in 1867, and spent much of the following decade cycling through aliases Webb, Webster, Gibbs, Gibbons. Lawler, along with petty theft and prison sentences, 18 months in Wandsworth for 36 counts of larceny in 1875, another 12 months for the same crime in 1877. Long before she ever impersonated Julia Thomas, Webster had already made a habit of reinventing herself for whoever happened to be listening, she would later claim, in one of several unreliable autobiographical accounts, to have been married to a sea captain who died along with all of their children in quick succession, a story investigators were never able to substantiate. She had a 5-year-old son by the time she came to work for Thomas, being cared for by a friend during her frequent stretches in custody. None of this appeared on any reference. Thomas simply met her, liked her well enough on the spot, and hired her without a single inquiry into her character. The arrangement soured almost immediately. Thomas criticised Webster's cleaning constantly, going back over finished work to point out what she considered failures. Webster, for her part, grew openly resentful enough that Thomas began asking friends to stay overnight rather than be alone in the house with her. By the end of February, Thomas had had enough. Her diary entry from that week survives in full, gave Catherine warning to leave. Webster talked her into staying 3 extra days, through Sunday the 2nd of March. That Sunday afternoon, Webster went to the local alehouse during her half-day off and came back late, delaying Thomas's trip to evening church. The 2 women argued before Thomas left. Several members of her congregation later said she'd arrived looking visibly agitated, telling them she'd been held up by the neglect of her servant to return home at the proper time. Thomas came home from the service around 9 that evening and went straight upstairs to confront her. What happened next, we only know from Webster's own account, given many weeks later. In her words, she and Thomas argued. The argument turned into a full quarrel, and in the height of her anger, she threw Thomas from the top of the stairs to the ground floor below. Thomas, badly hurt from the fall, began to scream. Webster said she grabbed her by the throat to keep the noise from drawing attention, and in the struggle that followed, Thomas was choked to death. Next door, Thomas's landlady and her mother heard a single thump, like a chair falling over. They thought nothing of it and went on with their evening. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of case we build a full documentary around cases that gripped an entire country and then largely disappeared from memory. If you'd like the next one the moment it's published, this is a good point to subscribe, because what Kate Webster did over the following 2 weeks is stranger than almost anything else in this channel's catalogue. What Webster did next, by her own later description, she did alone, in the house, through the night and into the following day. She removed Thomas's head using a razor, then used a meat saw and a carving knife to divide the rest of the body. She filled the laundry copper the large basin households of the era used to boil washing with water, and boiled the remains in it, in her words, to prevent identity. She opened the torso with the carving knife and burned what she could of the internal organs in the kitchen hearth. She would later say she was greatly overcome by the sight and the smell of what she was doing. None of it, however, drew any outside attention. Monday was washing day in most households on that street, and the unusual activity at Mayfield Cottages simply looked, to anyone passing, like laundry. Over the next 2 days, Webster kept up appearances answering the door for tradesmen, continuing Thomas's errands, behaving as though nothing at all had changed. Behind that performance, she was packing what remained of the body into a black leather travelling bag and a corded wooden bonnet box. 2 pieces wouldn't fit, the head and 1 foot. She threw the foot onto a rubbish heap across the river in Twickenham. The head she buried a short distance from the cottage, beneath the stables of a local public house called the Hole in the Wall. On the 4th of March, Webster travelled to Hammersmith to visit old neighbours of hers, a family named Porter she hadn't seen in 6 years, wearing Julia Thomas's own silk dress and carrying the travelling bag packed with what remained of the body inside it. She introduced herself to them as Mrs. Thomas. She told them an elaborate story, that she had married since they'd last met, had a child, been widowed, and had inherited a house in Richmond from an aunt. She invited the elder Porter and his son Robert out for a drink at a nearby pub. While they were inside, she disposed of the bag she'd been carrying almost certainly into the River Thames. It was never recovered. She then asked young Robert Porter to help her carry something heavier, a wooden box, from the cottage to the train station. Crossing Richmond Bridge together, she quietly dropped the box over the side into the river below. Robert noticed nothing wrong. Whatever she told him to explain it, it worked. Neither Porter had any idea, that evening, that the woman they'd shared a drink with had spent the walk to the pub carrying a bag containing what remained of her employer. The following morning, a coal porter named Henry Wheatley was driving his cart past Barnes Railway Bridge shortly before 7 when he spotted the box washed up in shallow water at the riverbank. Thinking it might contain stolen goods from a burglary, he pulled it from the water and opened it himself before ever calling for help. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, were human remains, a torso and a pair of legs, missing the entrails, missing 1 foot, missing a head entirely. Wheatley reported the discovery immediately, and a doctor was brought in to examine what he'd found. Working only from a torso and legs with no other context to go on, the doctor guessed incorrectly that the remains belonged to a young person with very dark hair, a description that couldn't have been further from a 54-year-old widow, and one that likely delayed any connection to Julia Thomas for as long as it did. Around the same time, the separately discarded foot turned up across the river in Twickenham. Investigators could tell both sets of remains came from the same body. They had no way whatsoever to say whose body it was. An inquest returned an open verdict. With no name and no family to claim her, the unidentified woman was buried in Barnes Cemetery on the 19th of March. The press, unable to resist a mystery with nothing else to call it, dubbed it the Barnes Mystery. Rumours circulated that the remains showed signs of having been used for anatomical dissection. A far grimmer rumour also began to spread that Webster had offered jars of rendered fat, taken from the boiled remains, to neighbours and a local pub as cooking dripping. No evidence for that claim was ever presented at trial, and the story exists in several conflicting versions, which strongly suggests it belongs with the folklore that tends to accumulate around infamous killers, rather than with anything that actually happened. It has followed this case for 140 years regardless. Meanwhile, back at Mayfield Cottages, Kate Webster kept living as Julia Thomas, in Julia Thomas's own clothes, dealing with tradesmen under Julia Thomas's own name. On the 9th of March, she struck a deal with a local publican named John Church, agreeing to sell him Thomas's furniture and household goods for £68, with 18 paid up front. It was a substantial sum, the equivalent, for a domestic servant of the era, of 2 or 3 years' honest wages. Here is where the impersonation finally came apart. When the removal cart arrived on the 18th of March to collect the furniture, Thomas's neighbour and landlady, a Miss Ives, asked the delivery men who had placed the order. They answered, Mrs. Thomas, and pointed to Webster standing nearby. Miss Ives hadn't seen the real Mrs. Thomas in nearly 2 weeks. Realising she'd been recognised as an impostor, Webster fled the house immediately, caught a train to Liverpool, and from there made her way back to Ireland. John Church, meanwhile, discovered he'd been thoroughly deceived. Going through the clothing he'd purchased, he found a letter addressed to the real Julia Thomas. He alerted the police at once. Officers searching Mayfield Cottages found bloodstains, small burned finger bones still in the hearth, fatty residue behind the laundry copper, and, left behind in the confusion of her sudden flight, a letter bearing Webster's own home address in Ireland. Scotland Yard put out a wanted notice with her description and her son's. They did not have to search long. The head constable of the Royal Irish Constabulary in Wexford recognised the woman being sought as someone his own force had arrested for larceny 14 years earlier. Local police traced her directly to her uncle's farm near Killarn and arrested her there on the 29th of March. She was returned to England under Scotland Yard escort via Kingstown and Holyhead to face trial for a murder that, only weeks earlier, hadn't even had a name attached to it. Her own uncle refused to take in her young son once he learned what she'd been charged with. The boy was sent to a workhouse to await a placement in an industrial school. Kate Webster would not see him again. The case, once her name became public, turned into one of the most closely followed criminal trials of the Victorian era, followed not only in Britain, but across the Irish Sea as well, where crowds gathered at nearly every train station to jeer at her as she was moved from Wexford toward Dublin. Webster's trial opened at the Old Bailey on the 2nd of July 1879. The scale of public interest was reflected in who showed up to prosecute her. The Solicitor General himself, Sir Hardinge Giffard, led the case for the Crown. She was defended by a well-regarded London barrister named Warner Slay, with Mr. Justice Denman presiding. Public fascination ran so high that on the 4th day of proceedings, the Crown Prince of Sweden, the future King Gustav V, sat in to watch. Before the trial ever reached a jury, Webster had tried to shift the blame onto 2 of the men she'd deceived, John Church and the elder Porter. Both had solid alibis for the day of the murder and were cleared without difficulty. Over the 6 days that followed, the court heard a long procession of witnesses reconstructing the case piece by piece. Miss Ives describing the moment she realised Mrs. Thomas giving orders to the removal men wasn't Mrs. Thomas at all, Henry Wheatley recounting the morning he pulled a wooden box from the Thames, the examining doctors walking the jury through the physical evidence recovered from the remains and from the house itself, tradesmen and neighbours describing their dealings with Webster during her 2 weeks of impersonation. Her defence leaned entirely on the circumstantial nature of that physical evidence, and on her devotion to her young son as evidence that she wasn't capable of such violence. It was a thin case, and it grew thinner the moment a bonnet maker named Maria Durden took the stand. Durden testified that Webster had visited her a full week before the killing, and mentioned she'd soon be travelling to Birmingham to sell off property, jewellery, and a house left to her by an aunt, a story Webster had no way of knowing would come true until she'd made it true herself. To the jury, it was unmistakable evidence that the killing hadn't been the sudden loss of temper Webster described. It had been planned in advance. Throughout the trial, reporters repeatedly described Webster as calm and stolid in the dock, sitting through days of testimony about the dismemberment of her employer without visible distress. She cried only once during the entire proceeding when her young son was mentioned in testimony. They convicted her after little more than an hour of deliberation. What happened immediately after the verdict was stranger than the trial itself. Before Justice Denman could pass sentence, Webster claimed she was pregnant, in an apparent last attempt to avoid the gallows. The court, caught entirely off guard, resorted to an archaic legal mechanism that hadn't been needed in living memory: a jury of matrons, a centuries-old common law safeguard that existed for exactly this scenario. English law had long held that an expectant mother could not be executed, and when a condemned woman raised the claim, the court had no way to verify or dismiss it, except by empanelling a jury of women on the spot. 12 women present in the courtroom that day were sworn in, joined by a surgeon, to examine Webster in a private room and determine whether she was, in the legal language of the time, quick with child. The examination took only a few minutes. Their verdict: she was not. Webster was sentenced to death. An appeal to the Home Secretary was submitted and swiftly denied. It's worth pausing on exactly why this case seized the Victorian public imagination as thoroughly as it did, because the reasons say as much about that era as they do about the crime itself. Nearly 40% of the female labour force in Britain at the time worked in domestic service, in households up and down the social scale, and the entire system depended on employers trusting servants who lived and worked in close, constant proximity to them. Webster's violence toward the woman who employed her struck directly at that fragile arrangement. So did her impersonation for 2 weeks. She had proven that a stolen dress, a confident manner, and a dead woman's belongings were enough to pass as respectable, a possibility that unsettled a society that liked to believe class and character were things you earned rather than simply put on. John Church, the publican she'd tried to frame, made the contrast sharper still. He was himself a former servant who had worked his way up to owning his own pub, exactly the kind of legitimate self-improvement Webster was accused of shortcutting through theft and murder. Newspapers of the day also seized on how thoroughly Webster failed to behave the way a Victorian woman accused of violence was expected to behave. She was described in print as gaunt, repellent, and trampish-looking, her physical strength and impassive courtroom manner treated almost as evidence in themselves, running counter to an era that insisted women were naturally passive and physically frail. And her nationality mattered enormously. Webster had emigrated from Ireland during the long wave of migration that followed the Great Famine, into an England that treated Irish immigrants with open suspicion and routinely associated them with criminality. One writer summarising her trial a few decades later described her as hardly human language that reveals rather more about Victorian prejudice than it does about Kate Webster. On the night before her execution, Webster finally abandoned every version of the story she'd been telling for months. In an earlier statement, she'd tried to implicate a man named Strong, the presumed father of her son, as a participant in the killing. Now, on her last night alive, she withdrew that claim entirely, took sole responsibility for what she had done, and formally cleared Church Porter, and Strong of any involvement whatsoever. She was hanged the following morning, the 29th of July 1879, at Wandsworth Prison, at the hands of William Marwood, one of the era's most experienced executioners. Marwood had developed what became known as the long drop technique specifically to correct the failures of older hanging methods, which frequently left prisoners to die slowly of strangulation rather than a quick broken neck. By carefully calculating the length of the drop against each prisoner's weight, he aimed to bring about death almost instantly, a genuine, if grim, innovation that other executioners across Britain would go on to adopt. She was buried in an unmarked grave inside the prison walls. A crowd gathered outside cheered as the black flag was raised over the gatehouse, the traditional signal that the sentence had been carried out. The day after her execution, an auction was held at Mayfield Cottages to sell off what remained of Julia Thomas's estate. John Church, remarkably, ended up purchasing much of her furniture anyway, along with her pocket watch and the very knife that had been used to cut her body apart. The laundry copper sold for 5 shillings. Other visitors, unable to afford or unwilling to buy anything so grim, simply took pebbles and twigs from the garden as souvenirs. The house itself stood empty for 18 years. Nobody wanted to live there, and even after someone finally did. Servants reportedly refused to work inside its walls. Local legend later held that a ghostly figure, sometimes described as a nun, could be seen hovering near the spot where the unidentified remains had first been laid to rest in Barnes Cemetery. When the writer Elliot O'Donnell went looking for signs that Mayfield Cottages itself was haunted, he came away disappointed by every account. The house looked exactly like what it was, a neat, unremarkable Victorian villa, giving no hint at all of what had happened inside it. Webster's notoriety outlived her by decades, and she picked up a nickname to match Victorian London's taste for the theatrical. Newspapers and pamphleteers took to calling her the female Sweeney Todd, borrowing the name of London's fictional murderous barber to describe a very real crime. Within days of her execution, a publisher on the Strand rushed out a penny souvenir booklet titled The Life, Trial and Execution of Kate Webster, promising 20 pages covering her full history alongside a full-page engraving of the hanging itself. Madame Tussauds had a wax likeness of her on display within weeks of her arrest, well before she'd even stood trial, advertised simply as the Richmond murderess. It remained on show well into the 20th century, standing alongside figures like Burke and Hare and the poisoner Hawley Harvey Crippen. Street ballads about the murder were printed and sold before the trial had even concluded, set to the tunes of popular songs of the day. For a case with an unidentified victim and an incomplete body, the Victorian public treated it as one of the defining crimes of the era. And then, for over a century, it simply became history, a grim, well-documented case, with one loose thread nobody expected to ever be tied off. Julia Thomas had a body, buried in Barnes Cemetery, under a name given to her only after her death. She never had her head back. In 1952, a young naturalist named David Attenborough and his wife bought a house in Richmond, sitting between the old Mayfield Cottages and that same public house, the Hole in the Wall, where Kate Webster had once buried what she couldn't fit into her luggage. Neither Attenborough nor anyone else had any reason to think about that connection for the better part of 60 years. The pub itself closed in 2007 and sat empty until Attenborough purchased the property in 2009, intending to redevelop it. On the 22nd of October 2010, workmen carrying out excavation at the rear of that old pub, clearing ground for Attenborough's planned redevelopment, uncovered what they described at first as simply a dark, circular object buried beneath foundations that had stood for at least 40 years. It took only a moment of closer inspection to recognise it for what it actually was. It was a human skull. Word spread quickly that it might belong to Julia Thomas, and the coroner asked Richmond police to formally investigate. Carbon dating carried out at the University of Edinburgh placed the skull's age somewhere between 1650 and 1880, and its position resting directly on top of a layer of Victorian floor tiles pointed toward the very end of that range. The skull showed fracture marks entirely consistent with a fall down a flight of stairs. Its collagen levels were unusually low, consistent with having once been boiled. DNA testing wasn't possible. Julia Thomas had died childless, with no traceable living relatives, and there was no surviving record of exactly where in Barnes Cemetery her body had been buried more than a century earlier, so there was nothing directly left to compare the skull against. But in July of 2011, the coroner concluded, based on everything else, that the skull did belong to Julia Martha Thomas. The original 1879 open verdict was formally replaced with one of unlawful killing. Cause of death, asphyxiation, and a head injury, a finding that matched, almost exactly, the account Kate Webster had given the night she finally told the truth, 132 years earlier. Julia Martha Thomas spent 13 decades as an unidentified skull buried beneath a stranger's stable floor, in a garden that would, entirely by chance, come to belong to one of the most famous broadcasters in the world. She got her name back in the end. It just took longer than almost any other case on this channel to arrive. So here's the question I asked you back at the beginning. Kate Webster changed her account of that night more than once, tried to send 3 innocent men to the gallows in her place, and only told the truth in the final hours before her own execution. And yet the very last version she gave, thrown down the stairs, then strangled to stop the screaming, is the one version that a modern coroner, working from a skull found 132 years later, found no reason to doubt. Do you think a confession made at the very last possible moment, with nothing left to gain from lying, deserves more trust than everything a person said before it? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want next week's Forgotten Case the moment it's published, you already know what to do.